Hello, I'm Bruce DuPoit. Coming up today on News Talk, Congress returns to town with a full plate of unfinished business from earlier in the year. Atop the agenda, the Iran deal and keeping government agencies funded. Also, is John Boehner's time as Speaker coming to an end? New reporting today suggests the discontent with him may be rising and his willingness to endure constant sniping may be nearing an end. We'll discuss all of these issues with reporter James Homan of The Washington Post. Also, D.C. unveils a new plan to help people who lack a place to live. We'll talk with Laura Zeilinger, Director of the D.C. Department of Human Services.
From News Channel 8, this is News Talk with Bruce DuPoit.
Hello and welcome. It is great to have you with us today. A new homeless initiative has been unveiled by D.C.'s Mayor Muriel Bowser, and with her top person at the Department of Human Services. Laura Zeilinger is that person. She is here today on News Talk to kick things off as we begin a new week. Great to have you here. Thanks so much for your time.
Bruce, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It is good to have you here. This is an important issue for the city and the region, and I can't help but suspect that there was a desire within the administration to get started early. We are sweltering under summer now, but winter is coming, and the last thing any city wants, the last thing D.C. wants, is to be caught flat-footed or unprepared when cold weather hits and the needs of families across the city becomes really critical.
That's right. And I think it's also important to understand that cold weather doesn't cause homelessness. Certainly, people are at much graver risk when they don't have a safe place to be and the weather is cold. But the work that we're doing is really about how we create a system that helps people when they experience homelessness at the time that crisis hits, so that they can access the supports they need to very quickly transition back to the stability of housing in the community.
What's the initiative all about? How do you intend to meet the needs of whoever has a housing insecurity problem this fall, this winter?
So earlier this year, really within Mayor Bowser's first 100 days, the District's Interagency Council on Homelessness released a new strategic plan, Homeward DC. And the announcement that we did last week is really about the elements of that plan that are focused on families. We've seen that D.C. General, as a large congregate shelter for families, is certainly no way for families to be supported when they're in crisis, and we need to transition our system to something different. So the strategy, the other thing that has been different is that families have only been able to access emergency shelter when they have a right to shelter when in the winter time. So the changes that we're making put more prevention resources out into the community to try to prevent families from even needing a shelter stay before their housing becomes completely insecure and they've run out of options. When they experience homelessness, changing, being able to transition out of D.C. General to smaller community-based shelters throughout the entire city, not congregated in one space, with the supports to enter housing with some affordability.
In terms of the prevention piece, the prevention part of this broader plan, how do you identify, how do you find people who may be coming up to an end-of-the-month situation where they just don't have the rent money for the first of the month and they're facing a crisis? How do you find them and how do they find you?
So families come to Virginia Williams Family Resource Center in the District of Columbia when they're seeking homeless services. And we see that 43% of the families who come seeking shelter at Virginia Williams have been there 2 to 3 times before they actually are at the point where they're entering shelter. So those have been missed opportunities in the past to help before people run out of options. And the other thing to understand is 86% of the families in the shelter system in the district were doubled up with family or friends before they became homeless.
Gotcha.
And so there's opportunities to support those households differently so that people can transition from a situation when they're staying with others to get supports with alternate housing without the shelter system needing to be the place they come for help.
What does that help look like?
So that help looks like a number of things. The majority of families who experience homelessness are also participants in our TANF program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, where they have access not just to cash assistance, but supports with finding work. So it's both addressing the income support needs and the educational needs of the family, as well as other mediation and counseling to help if people are in a situation where there's a lot of conflict that's leading to the instability, but also help finding other housing that's available in the community. We can support with first month's rent, security deposit, and really help people get back on their feet. Right now, the shelter system is where people often come for that resource, and we want to be able to help people in other ways so that shelter is available for people who really do have no other options.
Did I read recently, perhaps as part of the rollout of this new initiative, that a rethinking of how efficiency apartments can be utilized even by a family, some redefinition of that, or rethinking of that space opportunity is part of the mix here? So in families in permanent housing access apartments, and we try to connect them with a size of apartment that they're going to be able to afford in the long run, where their support rent, when they may not anymore receive rental supports from the district government. But what you did see is a legislative proposal that looks at the way that we shelter families. So right now in the district's law, we're supposed to provide families shelter in apartments. And if we run out of apartments, we can place them in a private room with 4 walls, a door that closes, the privacy of a private room. What we're saying is we're looking to replace the DC General and transition to smaller community-based shelters, that some of those may not be, that those largely will not be apartment buildings and single apartments, but they will also be private rooms, much smaller facilities, so that shelter serving the purpose of shelter, and that we can use the budget we have to replace the scale in multiple facilities in a way that will support families in shelter. Do you still anticipate using hotels as part of the mix, particularly as we get into crisis weather? And do you still anticipate using DC General in some way? So this winter, we will be in DC General and we will be in motels. This is a plan that we're not able to transition immediately. We're really talking about a systems change that, again, is preventing more families from experiencing homelessness and putting the resources out there to help families very quickly exit homelessness, as well as closing DC General and bringing other shelters online. This winter, we will continue to be in DC General. We will continue to need overflow shelter and motels, but this will equip us to transition to our system of homeless services. That's something that looks very different over the next several years. Not suggesting for a moment that the city shouldn't do everything it can to make sure that individuals and families have a place to stay, but I am curious, because people associate cities with help in this area, does the district end up being the homelessness provider for the region, perhaps because the counties around DC don't have the resources to help in this area, or choose not to make resources available? Do you end up as the provider, not just for folks within the district, but for the region? So there's a couple ways to think about that. We are the only jurisdiction in the region that has a right to shelter when the weather is cold. So we do invest a lot here in the District of Columbia in emergency shelter. That said, we have a regional partnership with other jurisdictions and with the Council on Governments, where we are all looking at ways across the region to bring more services and invest in the solutions and the affordable housing that's needed. Throughout the country, most jurisdictions, most cities will say that people come to our city to be homeless because we provide services. So people are transient. People without housing, people with housing move about. We find that we're most successful when we are focused on how we meet the needs of the people who are in our community needing services and support. Does the initiative that you and the mayor rolled out the other day, is it contingent on, or does it require some sort of appropriation or legislative act by the D.C. Council? So there's appropriation in the district's fiscal 16 budget proposed by the mayor, approved by the Council. We spend $143 million locally in homeless services, and part of it is a shift in the way that we invest those dollars to make sure that we're investing in the solutions that will work
to prevent and end homelessness. There are two legislative actions that we're asking for from Council. One that allows us to have a more robust eligibility process where we can look at issues of eligibility, of opportunities where we can support families without them needing to come into shelter and keep them in a safe place while we would do that, as well as being able to shelter families in private rooms, not only in apartments, as part of our base inventory.
As we wrap up, no doubt you have your hands full trying to help to the maximum extent possible the people who come to you, the individuals, the families, and they have just run out of options. They're in a crisis. They need help, and you're hoping to provide it. There are other people that we walk past or drive past every day who live on a bench or sleep under an overpass. Are there people who, because of mental illness, substance abuse, a desire not to be in a shelter, are there people who are homeless by choice? That may be an awkward phrase, I don't know, but are there people who just prefer to be sort of on their own, and is it the philosophical view of the department that if they don't come to us, then how do you go get people who don't have a place? Or
yeah, we do a tremendous amount of outreach. I've been doing this work for some time in the District of Columbia and nationally. And I'll tell you that people don't decide one day, I just want to live outside. They might lose faith in themselves and their options and their ability. And when people are offered the stability of housing without preconditions, in a housing-first approach with the services to help them maintain that housing, they are tremendously successful. So we do proactive outreach. We are persistent. We need to let people know that we believe in them, that they can do it, that the resources and supports are there for them. And when we meet people where they're at, everybody wants the stability of a place that is home, and it is really our responsibility as a community to provide that to them.
Laura Zeilinger is head of the D.C. Department of Human Services, a new initiative on homelessness just unveiled by the administration in the last few days. Thank you. An important topic, of course, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming in. We'll step aside. Back, though, with much more News Talk right after this.